Hello and welcome to all of you to the Sideline event organized by International Muslim Women Union in collaboration with Kashmir Institute of International Relations and many other organizations. So we have all of speakers, most of them are online. So you will enjoy this online session. I will now request Madam Shaw, who is the permanent representative of World International Muslim Women Union, to welcome the guests. Madam Shaw, you have the floor.
Thank you and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of International Muslim Women Union, I welcome you to this seminar titled Women's Mental Health and Conflict Situations. The 1995 United Nations Beijing Platform for Action states that women have the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. The enjoyment of this right is vital to their life and well-being. Although 187 countries have ratified the UN Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, women in conflict zones remain at the high risk for mental health conditions due to violence, poverty, and other factors. However, there are programs and strategies that can help improve women's health and mental health. In 1999, women's mental health leaders from Europe, Asia, Africa, North and South America, and Australia initiated a fact-finding mission process to determine the psychological, cultural, and environmental factors most silent to women, mental health, and mental illness. Due to the ongoing conflict in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, over the past 32 years, there has been a significant increase in psychiatric morbidity. Studies reveal that the prevalence of the depression in the region is 66.72. The highest prevalence, 66.67, is among individuals aged 15 to 25 years, followed by 65 to 33% in those aged 26 to 35 years. The differences in the prevalence of depression among male and female is substantial, with women experiencing much higher rates. Depression is particularly prevalent in rural areas, 84.73%, compared to urban areas, 20 to 26%. Among rural women, the prevalence reaches a staggering 93 to 10% compared to 6.8 among men. Kashmiri women are particularly susceptible to highest rates of mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The ongoing conflict in the region exposes them to significant trauma, violence, and social disappointment, leading to a higher prevalence of mental health concerns compared to men. Studies consistently show that women suffer disproportionately from mental distress. Women experience profound fear and insecurity, especially following the tragic event of Kunan Poshpora and arrest of prominent political and social activists such as Zamur Habib, Asya Indrabi, Hamida Nasreen, and 12 women in different Indian jails. According to Saba Hussain, a well-known writer, she says, I quote, these women cannot sleep for months. They cannot change clothes or bath. They do not sit outside under the open sky and prefer to stay indoors. They cannot eat what is cooked at home. They struggle to face their families and they are not able to face the friends due to trauma. The life of women in prison for years have drastically altered their thinking and existence. They are confused. I met the women and political prisoners. I was at a loss, thinking about the brutalization they suffered. I wondered how they would regain their confidence and hope. They are in deep depression. They do not like to discuss their rape or revisit their trauma. They said, we have received no justice. We have got nothing but a bad name. According to the writer of the book, Kunan Poshpora, I quote, I learned how even one night or horror can deeply impact women's lives. For the people of Kunan Poshpora and indeed for future generations, the implications have been not only social and psychological, but also economic and physical. It is our responsibility to continue reminding this esteemed forum of these injustices, to repeat these stories until justice served and investigation as accountability begin against the perpetrators. The government of India has given a free hand to its army to suppress the political mass movement and target women, using them as weapon of war. Justice will prevail. We will achieve freedom, peace, and justice when you highlight these atrocities and support our right to self-determination. Just you supported East Timor and South Sudan. We believe in your wisdom and commitment to human rights. Thank you, everyone.
Introductory remarks and welcome to the speakers. I will straight away go to Dr. KIIR Prem Button Ford. Dr. KIIR is the director of the Cambridge Center for Applied Research in Human Trafficking, a research center which has in its profile of annual symposium been registering the voice and experience of survivors of human trafficking violations and associated trauma impacts for the last 15 years. She is a UK court-recognized expert in highlighting the long-term consequences of trauma related to violations and the consequences, and is currently building a fresh network to address how systems and organizations work within the ethical state matrices, which is a default setting for denial of the long-term gender impact of violence undertaken by the systems dominated by traditionally male interests. Madam, you have the floor.
Well, thank you so much. It's a odd joy, isn't it, to be brought together having to address the issue of I want to look at actually interstate, intercommunity violence and the particular impact that has long term on women and the children they have born and will bear, and the impact on what is, when we talk about mental health, it's like we sort of separate out the brain from the body, but actually we can't do that, can we? We are integrated entirely into the experience of our bodies, which our minds have to then digest what is occurring to them, particularly if we can't control the environment around us. And I'm sure that is one of the challenges that has been announced actually now for well over 150 years, probably further back in time. It's just that they weren't published, the thoughts of how women have had to digest and deal with the violence that is meted out to them, whether that's been through the atrocities of slavery. And I do work as a director of a research center on human trafficking, which engages some of the longer term descendants of the slavery enslavement story, that oppression of others done through power systems that seem to endure even into what is looked at as a late modern, technologically enabled universe, that power to destroy others' lives. And that happens through the manipulation and the suppression and violation on bodies and minds. And so I want to look at the main principles of what I'm going to call collateral gendered and civil damage post and peri-conflict. The damage that is done on people's bodies, particularly if it's external traces on the body, are looked at through health systems across the world, some better, some worse. But at least the physical impact can be traced. What happens in terms of what the United Nations started to pay very particular attention to post 2013, which is the violations that happen internally on the bodies of women through rape, and those forms of violence which take place in the context of war, whether those are international wars, whether they're internal civil war or whether they're militia, mineral access-based wars. I don't really mind which environments they take place in. The challenge is what to do and how to understand the impact of that form of internal violation that happens to the bodies of women that is so difficult to trace publicly, because the violation happens, but it's carried in the mind and the bodies of individuals, but doesn't become a major issue for state rectification and remediation. So that definitely impacts people's mental states going forward as well as their physiological. I am also wanting to highlight what happens when the bodies of males are destroyed by these activities of war, of state enlargement, or of civil disputes. What happens then to the women who are left behind, and indeed to their children? So we can talk in Kashmir of ghost widows, if you like, those who are not able to locate whether their husbands have been destroyed or not. And even when it is made clear that they have been killed, what happens in terms of their recovery, because the trauma is a deep grief wound that will take many years to rectify, let alone the economic violations that happen because the household has been essentially deconstructed around them. And if we think about these violations, rather like what happens when a software bug occurs into our computers and there's a viral attack on the inside of our computers. The hardware is one thing, the software is another. And we know how destructive a software attack is. I suggest that when we look at mental health and the trauma of these forms of violation, if we view it almost as a wholesale viral attack on the software that is actually our lives, it makes the life of a computer work. Without the software operating properly, you've not got anything. We have no conversation internationally. We have no conversation here today if a virus gets in, and the terrible deconstruction devastation that brings. I want to suggest mental health and traumatic long-term destruction of communities is, in a sense, like a full-scale viral attack on your software, our software and our system. And we should, in fact, I think if it was a technological attack, it would get a lot more, many more billions released and much more effort from the international networks to actually address it. The software that's being destroyed is in the mental health and well-being of many, multiple hundreds of thousands, millions indeed, of women and children across the world, trying to recover from what the collateral gendered impact is of violence in our world. And it is an ongoing, serious, sustained, and neglected area of what is to be done in terms of the recovery program. So this is why I am delighted to be present for this wider conversation that is taking place today between us. Many of us coming in as speakers online, some of you in the room, and we can't see the room, which is a shame, because I'd like to be able to see who is engaging with us in the room in Geneva, around not just the significance of the 1325 and the 2021 resolutions that are in place already in the UN, looking at sexual violence in conflict, but to say, you know, yes, you have these appalling events happening both inside the theaters, multiple theaters of conflict, but then this trauma that runs out for years, runs out in terms of the infrastructure, the economy, educational services, health services, the well-being and the attachment disruption that's happened for children, and as Shamim Shaw introduced for us as we got going in this side event, the challenge of the long-term depression, the long-term failure to be able to access hope, access the engine that goes off in us in life to be able to prosper and engage in life. The removal of that through trauma in its multiple forms is something that needs attention. The long-term collateral gendered impacts on both the mental health as well as all the other integrated pieces that make us the individuals who we are and the communities which both sustain us and we sustain. Women make up not only just a bit more than half of the world. Women's networks, women's nurturance, I would say, is the world, is the future of the world. And we neglect the well-being of women to our peril. And that's my starter. Thank you so much for inviting me. And for those of you who would like to explore a bit more of what we do on looking at trauma and human trafficking, which has been a neglected arena on recovery, please pop into our web link on which is ccarht.org, which is the Cambridge Centre that I have the privilege of directing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. KIIR, for your input. And now I give floor to Ms. Naila Abdiapkiani. She has joined us from Islamabad. Ms. Naila, you have the floor. Unmute yourself.
Okay.
Okay.
Distinguished delegates and respected audience, today I would like to speak about a tragedy that continues to unfold in silence: the crisis of enforced disappearances and the suffering of half widows in Kashmir. The UNHRC has recently placed significant importance on addressing enforced disappearances worldwide. Yet thousands in Kashmir remain unheard and their pain is unseen. 3 decades have passed. Families in Kashmir have lived with an unbearable wound. Although Indian government does not give any specific number of the people who have gone missing since 1989's uprising in Jammu and Kashmir, According to the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons, the number can be anywhere between 6,000 to 8,000. This association is a collective of relatives of victims of enforced disappearances in Indian administered Kashmir. With Khurram Parvez, the renowned human rights defender of Jammu and Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society, unjustly imprisoned for years and with severe communication blackouts and media restrictions in place since 5 August 2019, it is impossible to determine how many more lives have been swallowed by the shadows of enforced disappearances. The silence imposed on Kashmir has hidden the true scale of the ongoing tragedy. However, at least 8,000 to 10,000, as we have already discussed, men have vanished without a trace. The anguish of Kashmir's missing persons crisis deepens when we consider the discovery of mass unidentified graves. These graves scattered across the region. Some believe that these graves are linked to enforced disappearances, leaving behind some 1,500 to 2,000 women in an unimaginable state of limbo. These women are known as half widows. These women do not know if their husbands are dead or alive. They live in a world of uncertainty. They are unable to mourn. They are unable to move forward. Without death certificates, they are denied the most basic rights. They cannot access pensions. They cannot open bank accounts, or even they cannot claim ownership of the house they live in. Many face homelessness as property rights are withheld from them. The law does not recognize them as widows, as their husbands have not officially been declared deceased. The law does not recognize their grief, and it does not provide them with justice. Imagine their pain. They cannot remarry. They cannot inherit their husband's property. They cannot receive any legal benefits. Their struggle does not end there. Their search for their missed loved ones turns into a punishment as well. They knock on the doors of police stations, courts, and army camps only to be met with silence, or worse, accusations. Some are told fabricated stories that their husbands have crossed ceasefire line and they have become militants, stripping them of any right to compensation or support. Others suffer harassment, social stigma, and even sexual violence during their relentless search for answers. Economically, these women are left helpless. In a society where men are often the primary breadwinners, their absence pushes families into extreme poverty. Their children, too, suffer an identity crisis, growing up not knowing if their fathers will ever return. Despite these hardships, justice remains out of reach. The Armed Forces Special Power Act, AFSPA, protects perpetrators of human rights violations from persecution. Enforced disappearances remain a tool of oppression, unchecked and unpunished. In 2011, the state-run Human Rights Commission, which has obviously ceased to work since 2019, identified 2,730 unidentified bodies buried in 38 sites across northern Kashmir. It directed the government to investigate, but more than a decade has passed and no larger probe has ever been conducted there. This is not just a crisis, it is a systemic denial of human dignity. And the disappeared are not numbers. They were fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers. And those left behind, the half widows, are not just victims, they are women fighting against a world that refuses to see them even. We cannot allow their suffering to remain invisible. I urge this council and all the honorable members to take decisive actions. Pressure must be placed on India to ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. Mechanisms must be established to investigate these cases, deliver justice, and provide economic and legal support to those affected. The voices of Kashmir's missing persons and half widows must be heard, and their pain must be acknowledged. To the international community, I say that silence is complicity. Every moment we fail to act, another family is shattered, another life is lost to the shadows. We must stand for justice, for truth, and for humanity. It is time to amplify the voices of these forgotten women and children. It is time for action. Let us stand for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Let us demand justice for Kashmir's missing persons and half widows. Let us reaffirm that enforced disappearances have no place in a just and human world. Thank you very much, everyone.
which has been the cause of most of the these psychological trauma, including PTSD in Kashmir and depression of women and overdose and other things. So my next speaker will be Stila Harris. She is member of the Federation for World Peace.
Good morning, ladies. On this March. Good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me to this great occasion. I would like to take this opportunity to honor Ms. Shamina Shah and all the work that she does with the Kashmir Institute of International Relations. I got to know Ms. Shah pretty recently, actually, through Carolyn, and I was really privileged to be invited to speak at one of the side events at the United Nations in Geneva. And one of the things I mentioned at that side event was up until that point, I had never heard about the women of Kashmir. And to be honest, that calls into question the stories that are being told out there, the headlines that are being told out there, whose suffering is put on the forefront and whose suffering is put in the background. That was something that was deeply moving for me. As I did more research, I was absolutely baffled at what I found out regarding the women in Kashmir who for decades have survived conflict that has left psychological scars on the women, mothers who have lost their sons to enforced disappearances, wives who live in uncertainty as their husbands are detained indefinitely, and survivors of sexual violence who carry trauma that's both personal and political. In her speech earlier on, Ms. Sharma spoke about the alarming levels of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety among Kashmiri women. And yet, surprisingly, mental health services remain limited and largely overshadowed by militarization and fear. And you'll find that the more you look into it, the pattern that you see in Kashmir is not unique to Kashmir alone. If you look in Gaza, where relentless bombardments have left thousands dead, children who survive are wounded physically, they are also haunted by memories, loss and destruction and displacement. Reading a UNICEF report recently, it states that over 90% of children in Gaza suffer from severe psychological distress, experience night terrors, panic attacks, and inability to speak. We move over to Sudan. Women fleeing violence in Darfur face not just displacement, but rampant sexual abuse, which is weaponized as a tool of war. We spoke about this at the previous event. We're speaking about it today. I guarantee you, tomorrow at the next event, we'll still be speaking about this. Survivors endure lifelong trauma, which is then compounded by stigma that prevents them from seeking support. We cross over to Ukraine. An entire generation of children has been robbed of stability. The World Health Organization recently estimated that 1 in 5 people in conflict zones develop a mental health disorder. And yet, surprisingly, psychological support remains inaccessible to many. We can go on and on about this, but these are not isolated cases. It's a pattern. Women and children, as said by the previous speakers before me, suffer disproportionately as victims of armed conflict. There are patterns of suffering that tell us that mental health in war zones, mental health in conflict, it's not an afterthought. It is a frontline crisis that yet again and again is being ignored. Funnily, mental health is actually recognized as a human right. But if you look at armed conflicts across the world, it is the least prioritized when it comes to humanitarian responses. If you look at healthcare infrastructure, many war-torn regions that are experiencing conflict right now have healthcare systems that are on the brink of collapse or non-existent. Or they've got these systems that are severely underfunded, which are not fit for purpose. In many communities, psychological trauma is dismissed as personal weakness rather than recognizing it for what it is, which is a consequence of war. If we look across internationally, mental health remains underfunded. Resources are disproportionately allocated to physical rehabilitation, which matters, but also we should not ignore psychological healing. If we want to break the cycle of intergenerational trauma, it's important for everyone in this room, listening across the world, joining on Zoom, it's important to continue raising the profile of this issue. It's important for governments across the world to recognize that mental health must be prioritized as a core component of humanitarian aid. And this means that every refugee camp, every displacement center, every humanitarian mission must include trauma-informed care as a standard service. Psychological aid should be as fundamental as food and shelter. Psychological first aid should be treated with the same priority as physical first aid. Mental health services must be designated with a gender lens. Women who have survived conflict-related sexual violence need specialized care, which includes safe spaces, legal support, and long-term psychological services. And even as I am saying this, it saddens me to realize that these are aspirations, but we're still very, very far from even taking that first step. War robs children not just of their present, but of their future. Educational programs should integrate psychological support, ensuring that children returning to school are not just physically safe, but emotionally secure. And I'd like to cast our memories back, ladies and gentlemen, in the room and across the world, to the recent tensions, to the recent conflict that we saw between Israel and Palestine. When we speak about the mental impact of conflict, I'd like you to think about the mothers in Palestine. I'd like you to think about the mothers in Israel. All they want is their children to return safely from school. How can they be psychological safety? How can they be psychological peace when you don't know if your child is going to come back from school? When you don't know that the gunfire you're hearing in the background, has your child been a part of that? This is so, so important, and it's important for us to keep raising these issues to the governments across the world. We should keep speaking about the funding that's needed for programs that provide child-friendly spaces, trauma therapy, and family reunification. In closing, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for your patience, I just wanted to remind us of our moral obligation that wars don't end when that last bullet is fired. They continue in the minds of survivors, shaping generations to come. If we fail to address mental health in conflict zones, then we fail every person we claim to speak for. We fail every woman that we claim to protect. So it's important for all of us today to be collective in our call, to ensure that mental health is not a secondary afterthought, it is survival. Every woman and child that is trapped in the horrors of war, for every woman who cannot speak, we will speak for them. Let's stand together, not just in solidarity, not just for side events and meetings, but for action. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been the honor of my day-to-day speaking to you. Thank you very much.
आबिदा, please unmute yourself. आवाज नहीं आ रही है. Okay.
She has no joined. We can play the video message, recorded one. Yeah.
Okay, until Judy joins us, we have a video message from Caroline Hanson Moselle, the President Women's Federation for World Peace. Thank you.
Her voice is not coming in. I don't know.
Read it, somebody.
Yes, but now it's not working. Yes. Her voice is not letting. Yeah.
March 17th.
Now it's working.
I applied for a grant for National Ministry. My name is Carolyn Hanson. I'm president of the NGO Committee on the Status of Women in Geneva, and also director of the UN Office's Coordinating for the Women's Federation for World Peace International. I'm speaking to you today because my good friend, Mrs. Charmin Shaw, so much wanted
We can't hear Julie. We can't see her video.
He was at the Human Rights Council, important Human Rights Council event today, as I have done over the recent years. We met every time the Human Rights Council. She is a woman of incredible passion, and intelligence, and love, actually. And I could not let her down, even though I'm right out the door on my way to catch a plane to New York to represent you, American Black youth, at the 69th Commission on the Status of Women. So I wish you all great deliberations. I remember the many points and recommendations and good practices that I have heard from you, women of Asia, the Southern Africa, of course, Latin America, Europe, America, Asia Pacific, all over. I know so many women are working so hard and trying so hard. And we are really doing our best to really take care of each other, really to go together with common voices to our governments, to the United Nations, really pledge for partnership, to let them know how hard we are working and how serious we are, so that we are able to really fulfill those great promises at the time of the 1995 Asian Fourth World Conference, but it's also now including the SDGs and many other commitments that our governments have made that they cannot fulfill without us. So I just want to wish you a great day tomorrow, a great celebration. And I'm thinking of you, and I'll be really working for you while I'm in New York at the Commission on the Status of Women.
Thank you. This was video from Caroline. I think Julie has joined us.
Let me check.
Huh?
Julie has.
So,
Yes, she has joined
Julie,
us.
you have the floor.
Yeah, she's on unmute.
Okay, do I have the floor now? Yeah? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. Also, I have a very unreliable internet connection, so I may just go on voice if it starts to fade in and out, and you tell me if you can't hear me, okay? So first of all, thank you for inviting me. I believe I can always rely on my sister Shaman Shoal to make some really important meetings for many of us around the world during March, which became not just International Women's Day, but really a whole month for highlighting the situation of women and girls around the world. And mental health in conflict is a hugely important issue. I'm first of all just going to talk about an interaction that I had with the European Commissioner 18 months ago. At the time, I was in Greece, in the city of Elefsina, and the Greek Commissioner, Margaritas Chinas, came to a conference I was speaking at. He was the commissioner for promoting our European way of life. And this conference was a conference about arts and well-being. And it made me realize that mental health and well-being has become a bit of a kind of trendy subject for the developed world. With quite a lot of focus on, let's make sure we're all okay, and, let's do some self-care. And with little consideration for people in the rest of the world. And so he made his speech and didn't reference at all the thousands, hundreds of thousands of refugees and asylum seekers and people who have been fleeing war, coming across the Mediterranean, risking their lives, ending up living in squalid conditions on the islands and coastal cities and towns around Greece. And frankly, I was horrified that somebody could come to a conference and, be there for a photo shoot and say all these things, but actually have no connection, no idea really about the treatment of the most vulnerable people in the world experiencing conflict, many of whom have been trying to reach the shores of Europe. So I did actually follow him outside the room to suggest that this was a very poorly focused speech, actually, because it's partly because we were in Greece, we were in the place where all these refugees are coming. Anyway, I just wanted to set my intervention in that context of, if you like, the developed world's idea about mental health and what is now happening for people who are living through armed conflict. And I am going to talk about the situation in Ukraine and a little bit about the situation in Gaza, not because they are preeminent, but because everything that is being experienced by people under occupation in Ukraine and Gaza is also being experienced and has been experienced for decades by the people in Kashmir. So in Ukraine, 43% of children are showing psychosocial distress with symptoms of anxiety, fear, and irritability. Apparently, nearly 10 million Ukrainians, including 1.4 million children, are at risk of mental health conditions due to the war. This includes speech defects, uncontrollable twitching, nightmares, screaming in their sleep. And Save the Children, which is a very reputable global NGO, interviewed some families in Kharkiv, which is close to the front line. And children in these families, their hair had begun to turn grey because of the trauma and the stress of living under constant bombardment. And I know that I'm working very closely with Ukraine Solidarity Campaign and with the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Alexandra Matvichuk, who runs the Center for Civil Liberties in Kyiv. And Ukrainian women, many Ukrainian women are now half widows, so are now experiencing the very same situation that women in Kashmir have experienced for so long. And I hope that there can be solidarity between these different victims of various conflicts. I just want to turn to the situation in Gaza. I won't say too much because one of the previous speakers talked about this. But in February 2024, so a year ago, the Lancet, which is the British Medical Association's journal, published an article about addressing mental health crisis among children in Gaza. Even before the war started in October 2023, many children in Gaza had already experienced PTSD. I think 53.5% of Gazan children were already showing signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. And these conditions often go untreated due to a lack of awareness from health professionals and a shortage of mental health professionals. And restrictions on foreign aid only made this much worse. And I have to say that the current situation with regard to the administration in Washington is going to intensify and compound this already serious problem. So many children are deprived of the necessary care, and that jeopardizes their education, social integration, and even future employment, and perpetuates a cycle of social instability. Trauma can be generational, and I believe that is what we will see in Gaza, but both also in Ukraine, and I believe that that also happens in Kashmir. And another kind of worrying thing is that psychological distress can increase children and young people's susceptibility to radicalization, because extremist groups often exploit those feelings of hopelessness. In Gaza, the prioritization of more immediate crises, such as life-saving resources, food, water, sanitation, supplies, electricity, intensifies the challenge of providing youth mental health issues. And actually, we ought to be thinking about these invisible scars, these invisible conditions, as much as we're thinking about the physical manifestations. But one of the really important things that could be done is that the aid agencies, UNICEF and other people who are able to provide aid, I believe there's an organisation called the Education Above All Foundation, that establishing spaces for children to engage in physical exercise, group games, drawing, close interactions with care professionals, art and culture is actually really, really important. One of the most kind of wonderful things that I have seen when I've been looking at some of the social media coming out of Gaza is, in fact, the incredible youth circuses that have been happening with the children there, which give them, you know, a short moment of respite, a time to forget about the terrible things that have been happening, and a time to laugh and play and enjoy life. And so often culture is not seen as super important in governments, you know, where we have austerity and cuts and budgets being allocated to defence or to military. But we should also be thinking about all those really important social structures that we can put in place to help people deal with the kind of trauma that they're experiencing. I wanted to say something hopeful, because this is such a terrible time for so many people in the world. And with International Women's Day coming up tomorrow, that is an important day for women empowerment, for us to do something rather than to always be victims. So I want to leave on that kind of positive note, really, but also just to say thank you again so much for everything that you do to bring us all together in this important space. Thank you.
And for your input, I will now go straight away to Ms. Abida Rafiq. She will talk about the mental health and issues of the migrants of Kashmir, where we were forced to migrate to this part of Kashmir and also in of Kashmir. Madam Abida.
Yeah, thank you so much. The history of migration and displacement in Jammu and Kashmir is deeply rooted in four significant phases of migration that have shaped the region's current refugee crisis, starting from 1947, 1965, 1971, and later 1989, when the struggle of self-determination re-emerged in Indian occupied Kashmir, leading the forced migration of many civilians. The fourth phases ongoing today is driven by the continuing conflict and a cross-border tension causing widespread, especially among women, children, and vulnerable communities. I now draw your attention to the severe and ongoing mental health crisis among the refugees in Jammu and Kashmir, which has been further exacerbated and uncertain future of many individuals, particularly women. One of the poignant example is that of 200 women who were granted permission by the Indian government in 2010 to migrate to safer region due to escalating conflict. These women were promised they would be allowed to return home once the situation stabilized. However, over a decade later, they remain in refugee camps, still waiting to return while their families continue to live behind in Kashmir. They are now as a stateless women. These women who have been displaced for years live in precarious conditions without any form of identity documents. Lack of official recognition and status has left them in a state of profound uncertainty and vulnerability. They are unable to access to the basic rights because they lack the such documents behind. The situation has resulted in extreme psychological trauma, especially given the prolonged duration of their displacement. The trauma is not only from the loss of their homes, but also from the ongoing being separated from their families who still reside in Kashmir. The lack of clarity about their future and the absence of any pathways of return has left these women in a state of perpetual distress, with many suffering from symptoms of anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Report shows that 68% of displaced women in refugee camps exhibit signs of trauma, with many experiencing the insomnia, nightmares, and panic attacks. In the case of these 200 women, their mental health continues to deteriorate as they have been caught in a cycle of waiting with no resolution in sight. They are stranded in an emotional limbo, unable to move forward, to return to their life they once knew. The sense of being nowhere without a clear identity or future has led to severe trauma, affecting their mental well being, relationship, and overall quality of life. Such instance of displacement, where individuals are left with no clear solution, no hope for the future, underline the need of urgent intervention. These women experience are not isolated. There are countless others in similar situations who have been displaced and continue to live in prolonged uncertainty. It is imperative that the international community, along with the UNHCR, step in to offer not only the immediate mental health support, but also work toward finding a permanent solution to their displacement and restore their legal status and dignity. With this, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alda, for bringing the miseries of the displaced and migrant women in focus. With this, we have perhaps 1 to 2 minutes. If anybody has any question, yeah, yes, sir. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Shabnam Safarova. I'm from Azerbaijan. I thank all distinguished panelists for sharing the experience. Unfortunately, my country has experienced and we are still struggling with the traumas of these conflicts as well. Between 1988 1991, approximately 1,000 Azerbaijanis were expelled, forcibly expelled from Armenia like refugees. And following this event, the international recognized territories of Azerbaijan Karabakh were occupied, and in this case, 700,000 IDPs just left their lands, their region. And you know, the worst part of this issue is that when you are in conflict, to think about mental health becomes to be luxury. Just you try to survive and to keep alive you and your children within this conflict. It's a the part of and the second, personally for me, the second worst part is your trauma is transferable. You can transfer it to next generations, which later the next constellation is making better. Thank you very much.
Thank you for bringing the miseries of Azerbaijani people and displaced people into discussion. We always show our solidarity with the people of Azerbaijan, as Azerbaijan has been a great support to the people of Kashmir always. Thank you very much for your comment. And with this, we come to the conclusion of today's